For centuries, people have debated whether the Turks and Mongols are the same. They both ruled vast empires, shared a nomadic way of life, and were known as fierce warriors who reshaped history. But despite these similarities, the truth is far more complex. Are the Turks really Mongols? Or is there another story hidden in history and genetics that changes everything? The origin of the Turks begins thousands of kilometers away from modern-day Turkey. Their story doesn't start in Anatolia, but deep in the Altai Mountains, where modern-day Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Russia meet. This rugged, icy region is where the first Turkic-speaking people, known as the Proto-Turks, emerged. They were not Mongols, but they lived in the same regions, traded with them, and even fought against them. Ancient Chinese records referred to them as the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation that constantly clashed with Chinese dynasties. But here's where things get interesting. These early Turks were never a single, uniform group. Even from their beginnings, they were a mix of East Asian and West Eurasian peoples, blending cultures, languages, and even genetics. By the 6th century CE, the Turks had officially entered history with the rise of the Göktürks. This was the first empire to call itself Turk, and it stretched from China to the Caspian Sea. They created one of the world's first steppe empires, uniting scattered nomadic tribes under one rule. They even developed their own unique writing system, the Orkhon script, centuries before the Mongols had won. Unlike the Mongols, who followed their own belief systems, the early Turks practiced Tengrism, a spiritual tradition centered on the sky god Tengri. Their warriors were known for their discipline, strategic warfare, and ability to form powerful alliances, qualities that would later define the great Turkic empires. Despite their power, the Göktürks eventually fragmented, and new Turkic groups emerged, pushing westward into Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. This was the beginning of their journey toward Anatolia. But during this time, the Mongols were still not a major force. It wasn't until the 13th century, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, that the Mongols exploded onto the world stage. Their empire became the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. This is where many people assume the Mongols and Turks became one, but that's not entirely true. While it's true that many Mongol rulers recruited Turkic warriors, generals, and administrators, and even adopted elements of Turkic culture, the two groups remained distinct. The Mongols had a different language, different traditions, and a different identity. Even genetically, the Mongols were much more East Asian, while the Turks remained a mixed people. However, the Mongol invasion had a huge impact on the Turks. As the Mongols swept across Central Asia, they displaced many Turkic tribes, forcing them to migrate westward. These migrations led to the rise of Turkic states in Persia, the Middle East, and ultimately Anatolia. So, are the Turks Mongols? The answer is clear. While they share parts of history, they are separate peoples with different origins. The Turks built their own empires, spoke their own languages, and shaped history in their own way. But the influence of the Mongols cannot be ignored. They pushed the Turks into new lands, changed their power structures, and even influenced their military tactics. Yet, modern Turks are not Mongols. Genetic studies show that today's Turks have only about 10 to 20% East Asian ancestry, meaning they are mostly a blend of the many civilizations they encountered over thousands of years. For centuries, the origins of the Turkish people have been debated. Were they originally from Mongolia? Were they the same as the Mongols? Or is their history far more complex than most people think? To answer these questions, we need to go beyond surface-level comparisons and look at what genetics tells us about the Turkish people. Because the truth is, Turkish genetics reveal a story that history books often overlook. The origins of the Turks trace back to the Altai Mountains, where the first Turkic-speaking tribes emerged. These early Turks, known as the Göktürks, had strong East Asian features, but were not purely East Asian. From the beginning, they were a mixed people, blending with different groups as they expanded westward. As they moved, they encountered and intermarried with the Indo-European-speaking Tocharians, the Iranian-speaking Sogdians, and many other civilizations. This constant blending shaped their genetic makeup, making them unique among the nomadic peoples of the steppe. By the time the Turks entered Central Asia, and later Anatolia, They had already undergone significant genetic changes. But the biggest transformation happened when they arrived in the lands of the Persian Empire and the Byzantine-controlled Anatolia. Here, they mixed with Persians, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, and many other ethnic groups, creating an entirely new genetic identity. Unlike the Mongols, who remained relatively homogeneous in their core territories, the Turks continuously absorbed new populations wherever they went. This is why modern Turkish genetics look very different from those of the medieval steppe Turks. So, how much Mongol ancestry do modern Turks actually have? The answer might surprise you. Genetic studies show that the average Turk from Anatolia has only about 10 to 20% East Asian ancestry, which is a clear indicator that most of their DNA comes from local populations rather than the original Turkic conquerors. In fact, when we compare the genetics of modern Anatolian Turks to the Turkmen of Central Asia, we find that the Turkmen are much closer to the medieval Oghuz Turks, who originally migrated into Anatolia. This suggests that while the Turks brought their language and culture to Anatolia, their genetic impact was much smaller than many assume. The Mongol invasion also played a huge role in shaping Turkish genetics. As Genghis Khan's armies swept across Asia and into the Middle East, they forced massive population movements. Many Turkic tribes fled westward, further mixing with Persian and Arab populations. But interestingly, the Mongols themselves left very little genetic impact on Anatolia. Unlike Central Asia, where Mongol rulers settled and intermarried with the locals in Anatolia, Mongol rule was more about political dominance than large-scale migration. This is why modern Turks have far less Mongol ancestry compared to Uzbeks, Kazakhs, or other Central Asian peoples. Genetic studies also reveal another fascinating aspect of Turkish ancestry, its incredible diversity. A PCA chart, which maps genetic relationships between populations, shows that Turkish people are scattered across multiple genetic clusters. Some cluster closely with Iranians, others with Greeks, some with Caucasian peoples, and others with Central Asians. This proves that Turkish identity is not tied to a single race or genetic profile, but rather a rich blend of different civilizations. So, what does all this mean? It means that the Turkish people are not Mongols. While they share a historical connection and some genetic links, the vast majority of Turkish ancestry comes from the lands they settled in rather than the lands they came from. They are the product of centuries of migration, conquest, and cultural blending. Their story is one of transformation, starting as steppe nomads and evolving into one of the most diverse and historically significant peoples in the world. The idea that the Turks and Mongols are the same people is one of the most common misconceptions in history. At first glance, it's easy to see why. Both groups originated from the vast Eurasian steppes, lived as nomads, and built powerful empires that reshaped the world. But when we look deeper into their languages, cultures, and genetic histories, we start to see that the reality is far more complex. So, were the Turks actually Mongols? The answer is both surprising and fascinating. First, let's talk about language. The Turkish and Mongolic languages are not the same, though they share some similarities. Both belong to a larger group called the Altaic language family, which includes Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic languages. This has led some scholars to believe that they may have had a common linguistic ancestor thousands of years ago. However, this theory is still debated, and most linguists today believe that Turkic and Mongolic languages developed separately but influenced each other over time through close contact. One major difference is how these languages evolved. The Turkic languages, including modern Turkish, Uzbek, and Kazakh, spread widely from Siberia to Anatolia, adapting to many different cultures. Mongolic languages, on the other hand, remained more confined to Mongolia and parts of China. While the Mongols adopted many Turkic words during their expansions, the core structures of the two languages remained distinct. Now, let's look at culture. While both the Turks and Mongols were originally nomadic, their societies had key differences. The early Turks, such as the Gökturks, had a strong political structure with a ruling Khagan and a council of tribal leaders. Their empire functioned in a way that balanced nomadic traditions with organized governance. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan, took a different approach. They built a highly disciplined military state where loyalty to the Khan was absolute, and tribal identities were often erased for the sake of unity. Religion also separated the two groups. Early Turks practiced Tingrism, a belief system centered around the sky god Tingri, nature spirits, and ancestor worship. Over time, as they migrated westward, many converted to Islam, Buddhism, and even Christianity. The Mongols, on the other hand, also followed Tingrism, but they remained remarkably religiously tolerant even after converting to Buddhism or Islam. Unlike the Turks, who fully embraced the cultures they conquered, the Mongols often kept their own identity, distinct from the people they ruled. But the most definitive way to separate Turks and Mongols is through genetics. Many assume that modern Turks must have high Mongol ancestry because of their shared history. But genetic studies tell a different story. While the Mongols left a strong genetic impact on Central Asia and China, their influence on Anatolian Turks was minimal. In fact, modern Turks have far more genetic connections to Persians, Greeks, and Caucasians than they do to Mongols. A PCA genetic analysis shows that Turks today are spread across different clusters, some closer to Iranians, some near Greeks, and some with slight Central Asian influences. This diversity comes from centuries of mixing with local populations in Anatolia and beyond. On the other hand, Mongols have remained genetically closer to their original East Asian roots. This means that while Turks and Mongols share some distant ancestry, they are genetically very different. Even during the Mongol Empire, the distinction between Turks and Mongols was clear. When the Mongols conquered large parts of Central Asia and the Middle East, they ruled over many Turkic-speaking peoples, but saw themselves as separate. They did, however, adopt some Turkic customs, including military tactics and administrative systems. Over time, many Mongol rulers, such as those in the Golden Horde, intermarried with the local Turkic populations and gradually became more Turkic than Mongol. This is why some groups, like the Tatars of Russia, have Mongol origins but speak a Turkic language today. So, are the Turks Mongols? The answer is no. While they share historical connections and some distant ancestry, they are distinct peoples with different languages, cultures, and genetic backgrounds. The Mongols created the largest contiguous empire in history, while the Turks established some of the world's longest-lasting states, including the Ottoman Empire. They were allies, enemies, and rulers of each other at different times, but they were never the same people. The migration of Turkic peoples from the heart of Central Asia to Anatolia was one of the most transformative movements in history. But what truly set them apart was how they changed, not just culturally, but genetically, as they traveled. The original Turkic tribes, who once roamed the Altai Mountains, had distinct East Asian features. But by the time they settled in modern-day Turkey, their appearance had evolved drastically. How did this happen? What forces shaped the modern Turkish genetic identity? The story begins over 2,000 years ago when the Proto-Turks, ancestors of all Turkic peoples, first emerged in the vast steppes of Mongolia and southern Siberia. These early Turkic tribes, like the Gökturks and Xiongnu, were primarily a mix of East Asian and Siberian genetics. Chinese historical records describe them as possessing features similar to those of Mongolic and Tungusic groups. But as they expanded westward into Central Asia, they encountered Iranian-speaking groups, like the Sogdians and Tocharians, peoples with lighter skin, European-like features, and deep cultural roots in the region. Through conquest, trade, and intermarriage, the Turkic groups gradually absorbed genetic traits from these Indo-Iranian populations. This process accelerated when the Seljuks, one of the most influential Turkic empires, swept into Persia and the Middle East. They didn't just adopt Persian culture, they also mixed with the local population, adding more West Eurasian genetic influence into the Turkic bloodline. By the time the Oghuz Turks, the ancestors of modern Turks, migrated into Anatolia in the 11th century, they were already a highly mixed people. But their transformation wasn't complete. The Anatolian Peninsula was home to Greek, Armenian, Kurdish, and other indigenous peoples, many of whom gradually assimilated into the incoming Turkic population. Historical records and genetic studies confirm that this period saw another significant wave of intermarriage, further reducing the East Asian genetic influence among Anatolian Turks. One of the most interesting genetic clues lies in haplogroups, the markers of ancient ancestry passed down through DNA. Studies show that while modern Anatolian Turks do carry some of the same genetic signatures as Central Asian Turkic groups, Their DNA is predominantly West Eurasian, closely related to Greeks, Armenians, and Iranians. However, traces of their nomadic past remain. In some regions of Turkey, particularly in the central and eastern parts, East Asian and Siberian genetic markers are more prominent, a direct link to their Turkic ancestors. Another key moment that shaped Turkish genetics was the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. The Mongols pushed thousands of Kipchak Turks, Karluks, and other nomadic tribes further west, reinforcing the Turkic presence in Anatolia. Some Mongol soldiers even settled in the region, blending their lineage with the already mixed Turkish population. This period not only strengthened the Turkic identity of Anatolia, but also added yet another layer of genetic diversity. So, are modern Anatolian Turks still genetically linked to their Central Asian ancestors? The answer is both yes and no. While there is a clear genetic connection to the early Turkic nomads, the centuries of migration, conquest, and intermarriage mean that modern Turks are, in many ways, a hybrid population, one that carries the legacy of both East and West. This genetic blending reflects not just their history but their identity, making them one of the most fascinating ethnic groups in the world. The migration of Turkic peoples from Central Asia to the lands they now inhabit is one of history's most significant population movements. But what exactly caused them to leave their ancient homelands in the Altai Mountains and spread across vast territories? The answer is not simple. It's a mix of climate change, resource scarcity, warfare, and the pursuit of new opportunities. In the early centuries AD, the Proto-Turks lived as pastoral nomads in the heart of Asia, where they mastered horseback riding and survival in harsh environments. Their lands, however, were not static. Climate fluctuations led to prolonged droughts, forcing tribes to seek fertile grazing lands. But environmental pressure wasn't the only factor. The rise of powerful neighbors, such as the Chinese dynasties and Mongolic groups, often put Turkic tribes in a constant state of war, pushing them westward. The collapse of the Xiongnu Confederation played a crucial role in this migration. Some scholars believe that the Xiongnu, often identified with the early Turkic people, faced pressure from the expanding Han dynasty, which led to fragmentation. Some Xiongnu groups moved into Central Asia, merging with local populations and forming new tribal identities. This was the beginning of the westward Turkic migrations. By the 6th century, the Gokturks had established their powerful empire, stretching from Mongolia to the Black Sea. The political ambitions of Turkic Khagans also fueled expansion. Rulers sought new lands to dominate, and their warrior culture made them formidable opponents. The Turkic tribes didn't just invade, they adapted, formed alliances, and sometimes intermarried with local populations, absorbing new cultures along the way. One of the biggest migration waves occurred in the 11th century, when the Seljuks, a powerful Turkic group, entered Persia and Anatolia. Their military victories against the Byzantines, including the famous Battle of Manzikert in 1071, opened the door for Turkic rule in Anatolia. But even before this, Turkic tribes had already started integrating with Iranian, Arab, and Caucasian groups, creating the diverse ethnic mix that exists today. Another significant factor in Turkic migrations was the Mongol expansion in the 13th century. As the Mongols conquered Central Asia, many Turkic tribes fled westward to escape subjugation. Some were absorbed into Mongol armies, while others, like the Kipchaks and Cumans, moved into Eastern Europe. This chain reaction led to the rise of new Turkic states, including the Ottoman Empire. Turkic migrations weren't just about survival, they shaped the genetic and cultural fabric of regions from Siberia to the Mediterranean. While their journey started in the Altai Mountains, their adaptability and resilience ensured that they left a lasting impact wherever they settled. The genetic legacy of the Turkic people is one of the most debated topics in history. Were they originally a single, homogeneous group, or did they emerge through centuries of mixing with different populations? Modern DNA research has finally given us clear answers, and the results challenge many long-held beliefs. The earliest ancestors of the Turks, known as the Proto-Turks, originated in the Altai Mountains of Central Asia. Ancient DNA analysis confirms that these early Turkic groups had strong genetic ties to East Asians, particularly to populations in Mongolia and Siberia. However, from the very beginning, they were never purely East Asian. Even the earliest Turkic individuals show a blend of East Eurasian and West Eurasian genetic markers, meaning that interactions between different populations started long before their migrations. As the Turkic people expanded westward, they encountered and mixed with various groups, including Iranians, Tocharians, and later, Slavs, Arabs, and Anatolians. This intermixing is evident in the genetics of modern Turkic populations. Studies show that while Turkic speakers from Central Asia, such as Uzbeks and Kazakhs, have higher East Asian genetic components, those in Turkey and Azerbaijan have a much greater proportion of West Eurasian ancestry. This aligns perfectly with historical records of migration and assimilation. One of the most interesting findings comes from the DNA analysis of medieval Turkic remains, particularly those from the Göktürk and Seljuk periods. These samples reveal that the original Turkic conquerors who arrived in Anatolia were genetically closest to modern-day Turkmens. However, due to centuries of intermarriage with the local population, the genetic profile of the Anatolian Turks gradually shifted towards a more West Eurasian appearance. This genetic transformation can also be tracked through East Asian ancestry markers. While Central Asian Turkic groups retain around 40 to 50% East Asian ancestry, modern Turks in Anatolia only have about 5 to 20%. This indicates that the Turkic migration to Anatolia was more of an elite conquest rather than a mass population replacement. Instead of wiping out the native populations, the incoming Turks merged with them, spreading their language and culture while absorbing local genes. Another fascinating discovery is the genetic connection between Turkic and Mongolic peoples. While the two groups share linguistic similarities, their genetic histories are distinct. Mongolic groups tend to have a much higher proportion of East Asian ancestry, whereas Turkic populations show a wider range of genetic diversity due to their long history of migration and intermixing. Ultimately, the genetics of the Turkic people tell a story of adaptability and integration. Unlike some other ancient civilizations that remained isolated, the Turks expanded, absorbed, and evolved with each new region they entered. This ability to merge with different cultures is what allowed them to establish some of the greatest empires in history. The influence of Turkic migrations on modern populations is undeniable. But how did these movements shape the genetic and cultural landscape of the regions they entered? From the vast Eurasian steppes to the heart of Anatolia, Turkic expansion left an imprint that can still be traced today, both in DNA and in the languages, traditions, and identities of millions of people. The first major migration of Turkic peoples began over 2,000 years ago when the early Proto-Turks started expanding out of the Altai region. By the time of the Göktürks in the 6th century, they had already spread into Central Asia, forming political alliances, intermixing with local groups, and influencing trade networks along the Silk Road. As they moved westward, the Turkic tribes absorbed genetic and cultural elements from Iranian, Tocharian, and Ugric peoples. One of the most transformative periods of Turkic expansion was the rise of the Seljuks. These nomadic warriors moved from the Central Asian steppes into Persia, the Middle East, and Anatolia, bringing with them not just their language, but also their unique governing style, military tactics, and religious influences. However, unlike the Mongols, who often maintained their distinct identity in conquered lands, the Turks merged with the local populations. Genetic studies confirm this historical pattern. The modern populations of Turkey, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan all show varying degrees of Turkic ancestry, but none of them are purely descended from the early Turkic groups. Instead, the genetic legacy of the Turkic migrations is layered on top of earlier populations. In Anatolia, for example, the majority of modern Turkish DNA comes from pre-existing Anatolian and Balkan populations, with only 10 to 20% of the genetic material tracing back to the original Turkic migrants. This aligns with historical records, which suggest that the Turkic takeover of Anatolia was not a mass migration, but rather an elite-driven cultural transformation. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century played another crucial role in reshaping the Turkic genetic landscape. As the Mongols pushed westward, they displaced many Turkic tribes, causing a secondary wave of Turkic migrations into the Middle East and Eastern Europe. This is why populations such as the Crimean Tatars and the Uzbeks have mixed Mongol-Turkic ancestry, while others, like the Turkmens and Azerbaijanis, remain closer to their original genetic and cultural roots. Even today, the effects of these migrations are visible. The Turkic language family is spoken across a massive geographic range, from the frozen tundras of Siberia to the Mediterranean coast. Traditional Turkic customs, such as equestrian culture, wrestling, and specific musical styles, have been preserved in different forms across these regions. The story of Turkic migrations is not just one of conquest and expansion. It is a story of adaptation and integration. Unlike some civilizations that sought to replace or eliminate local populations, the Turks often assimilated into the societies they entered, leaving behind a complex but undeniable legacy.